Namaskar, and welcome to our self-development section for tonight's session. As we discussed earlier, our topic for discussion for today is the summary of Charles Duhigg's best-selling self-help book, Smarter, Faster, Better. Please note this summary is the first part of this two-part series. There was so much to discuss that I decided to break this summary into two sessions. So for all of you who are tuning into today's session, I thank you, and I invite you to join us back next Sunday for the second part of this summary. As I already mentioned, I think we already went through all of the topics that Charles Duhigg mentioned in his book that I thought in some way were relatable to our evening meditation sessions. I tried to incorporate topics that spoke about not only enhancing productivity in things we do at work, at home, but I also tried to include things that the author mentioned when that pertains to being mindful through all of these things that we go through every day. So along with increasing our productivity and staying mindful through it, we discussed things that would help us just derive a deeper meaning through the things we did every day. So keeping that in mind, I'd like to summarize today's summary. We're gonna discuss motivation, focus or how to enhance focus, and goal setting. So just a quick recap of these three topics that we discussed. And along with these three topics, I'd like to discuss one fundamental truth and some tricks. So before we get into like the details of motivation, focus, I'd like to get philosophical. We just had a nice meditation session, so I think it makes sense to talk about philosophy right now before we get into the technicalities of motivation and of focus. So I'd like to talk about stages of life, starting with a few examples of different stages of life. So I think beginning a career or a job, a degree, a relationship, or even a vacation is a start to a stage in our life. Some other examples are starting a semester, going on a date, starting a week at work, at home, or even starting a day at the beach. Right? And the reason why I wanted to start with examples of stages is to show you how all of these stages vary across a wide gamut. All of these stages are pretty different to some other stages. On the other hand, they're pretty similar to yet some other stages in just this small sample that we just looked at. And with this, I wanted to share something that I noticed as I read Charles Duhigg's book. So I'm actually not going in the order of the summaries I showed you. So I'm starting halfway below this list of topics that I just shared. So this was the fundamental truth about all of our lives, is that all of our lives consist of certain stages. And I would go on to even say that all of our lives in some way are always part of one stage or the other. There's always some stage, maybe there's parallel stages that are going on in our lives. And I think all of these stages can generally be broken down into these two groups of stages of life. One group being the long-term stage, another being the short-term stage. And I am aware that there can be certain stages that are beyond the long-term and the short-term. I can imagine stages that are extremely long-term or other stages that are like mid-term. But just to keep things simple, now that we've accepted the fact that all of our lives almost always are engaged in some sort of a stage of life, let's just break them down into these two stages, long-term, short-term. And I'd like to discuss certain attributes of these long-term and short-term stages So that this can nicely segue into the discussion of motivation, focus, of making goals, goal setting. So something about short-term stages is that they're more likely to repeat compared to long-term stages that are not as likely to repeat. Right, an example of a short-term stage, a week at work, right, happens 50 times a year, but a long-term stage like starting a new job doesn't happen nearly as often. Right? Another interesting attribute of short-term stages are that their outcomes are immediately perceivable. Right, so let's say I went for lunch with a friend, right? So the weather that day, the food we eat, the music that's playing in that cafe, our moods, right, have an immediate effect on our experience at lunch and after, right? So this short-term stage, we feel the outcomes almost right away and even during it, right? But let's compare that to long-term stage. Maybe I'm going to school to get a degree, right? It's a 2-year program. And I did end up getting that degree, right? But the outcome of me actually getting that degree didn't really translate into a meaningful job after graduation. Maybe I got a job, maybe it's not as meaningful right away, right? But maybe a few months or a few years down the line, I actually did get a good job because of the degree I got a few months or a few years ago. So now this outcome is apparent. Now I'm glad that I actually got that degree, you know, a while back, because now there's a market for this type of skill, right? Um, Another attribute is of a long-term stage really is, if you think about it, right? Going to a school, getting a degree, this long-term stage really comprises of several short-term stages. So in a way, a long-term stage is really several short-term stages that come together, that contribute towards that one long-term stage. And again, just by the nature of events, these short-term stages, as we already discussed, they repeat more often. But long-term stages, they don't repeat as often. And in some cases, they might just occur once in your lifetime. Like, let's say again, going to school, right? I went to school day one, my classmate that was sitting next to me, I spoke with him. We hit off on a good note. We became good friends, you know, in our first week at school, during the 2 years of going to school. And now for me, it's been 5 years since I graduated. So 2 years of school plus 5 years. Now this friend of mine and I, we're best friends, right? So for me, this has happened. This has happened just once in a lifetime. I went to college once in my lifetime, and I made a best friend from college just once in a lifetime. Now, if you're a very friendly, popular person, maybe you can make many more friends. Maybe you could even make more best friends. But maybe if you just never go back to school, you'll never have that experience of being best friends with somebody in your class you met on your first day. Right? Just a simple example of a long-term stage that occurs only once in a lifetime. So reason why I started to talk about stages is to actually see how motivation, how being focused really are affected directly from these different stages in our lives. A great example of the transition of a short-term stage into a long-term outcome, a long-term stage, is something that we see in nature, right? Planting a seed. So planting a seed is something that's a short-term action. We just plant a seed on one day and we don't have to do it again, right? Then we keep watering that seed, and that's another short-term thing that happens daily, right? But then there's just one long-term outcome, right? Which is maybe after several days, months, or even several years in certain trees cases, that seed finally transforms into a full-blown, a large tree, right? So as we're going through these short-term stages, it's possible for us to reconsider our approach. We might realize, hey, the way I'm watering this seed isn't really helping. So maybe let me change that. Maybe it's not getting enough sunlight in this place. So maybe let me even move the seed from one place to the other. Or maybe if the seed is a small plant, I can actually repot it from one end of my yard to another, right? To let it get more sunlight. But at one point, once all of these short-term stages are over, and once this plant starts becoming a big tree, maybe at that point I might not be able to change my decisions or change my change my attitude towards this long-term stage. So the reason why I decided to talk about the transition of short-term stages into the long-term stages is to sort of echo on this recurring question, which I kept asking myself throughout the first few sessions of our self-development series. And those two questions were the questions of the why and the questions of the how. If you guys were part of these sessions, and even if you are not, doesn't matter. But I think these two questions are pretty important. And I think they're just as important as the other question. And I think the why question of why am I doing something relates more to the longer term stages or the longer term goals that I have. And the how question of how should I go about something, how should I do something, I think pertains more to the short term stage or short term goals or agendas that I might have. Now, with most other things in life, it's not like black and white. There are gray areas. So in certain cases, I might have a why question in the short term. So let's say maybe I'm at work, right? And I'm having a pretty difficult day at work. So I might ask myself, hey, why am I doing this? Why did I put myself into here, right? Or I might actually, on the other hand, find myself enrolled in a school program, in a school degree, and I had these dreams of graduating with a certain technology degree. But now that I am into this education and I find that it's pretty difficult, right? I might start wondering, hey, how am I going to actually manage graduating? How am I going to actually manage learning this difficult programming skills that the school is trying to teach? Right. So the why and how, they could be interchanged with the short term and long term stages of your life, but predominantly, I think the why has to mostly do with the long term stages of our life or with the long term visions of our life, whereas the how has more to do with the short term goals or the short term pursuits that we might have. And these two questions, I think, directly answer or directly help us either stay motivated or stay focused. So by that I mean, knowing the answer to why am I doing something directly tells me what motivates me, right? Because when I know why I'm doing something, it shows me my own reason or my own intention of me doing something, right? Be it getting a degree, be it planting this particular tree in my backyard. So when I know why I'm doing it, I know what motivates me, right? On the other hand, when I know how to go about something, when I know how to properly care for this plant, for this seed, right? This knowledge of how to go about something, that helps me stay focused, right? And again, as we already discussed, things are not black and white, things are gray. So I could think about the why, and that can help me stay focused. So, right, so when I'm feeling distracted, I could remind myself of the why I'm doing something. Why am I getting this degree? Why am I why am I watering this plant every day? Oh, I remember, because I want this degree, or because I want this beautiful tree in my backyard. Okay, so I guess that makes it worthwhile, taking care of this little sapling, even though it's not convenient for me always, right? So this is how I think the questions of why and how not only help us get in touch with our long-term goals and our short-term pursuits toward those goals, they also help us realize our motivations and help us stay focused. So along with staying motivated and being focused, we discussed setting goals, right? Setting goals effectively. So I think what makes goal setting unique compared to being motivated or being focused is that goal setting, in a way, has just as much to do with the long term as it has to do with the short term. So when I think about my long term plans, that in a way inspires me to do something that sounds really extraordinary or really awesome, almost unimaginable at this point, right? So an example for this is when I was 21 years old, I was pretty tied in mentally. I felt like I wanted to break free of my comfort zone. So thanks to my parents' support, I moved to a different country for my graduate education, right? And I decided I'm gonna get this degree, and I'm gonna take things from that point onwards. right? So that was a long-term vision for me, right? Moving myself to a completely different country, somewhere I'd never been before, right? Going to school, being amongst people I'd never met before. So knowing my long-term vision forced me or helped me to create a stretch goal, something that seemed pretty unimaginable, but I decided to just, set my best foot forward, of course, with people's help, and I set about it. So having a long-term vision, knowing why I wanted to do that, knowing what motivated me, helped me set a stretch goal, right? And on the other hand, knowing how, either by reading books, by observing people, by taking people's help, right? Through this degree, I was able to focus and I was able to break down this long-term stretch goal into smaller goals, which the author referred to as SMART goals, as a lot of other self-help books relate to as well, right? So we discussed SMART goals are goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, reasonable, timely. And if you evaluate and reapply yourself on SMART goals, they become smarter goals, right? So this is how like a long-term vision, a short-term plan, and introspection of the why and the how help us with goal setting as well. So I going back to the tricks that I mentioned, let's talk about some tricks that are going to help us through these three main topics that we discussed. Tricks to staying motivated. So apart from all these different stages that we discussed, I think what I gained from Smarter, Faster, Better is the one thing that helps us stay motivated is knowing what we can control. Because there are always going to be things that we cannot control, things that are outside of our jurisdiction of control. But knowing the fact is there's always going to be something that we can do about it, something that we can control. So knowing that something like this exists that I can actually have an effect on is the by far the biggest way to stay motivated, according to the author, according to my own practical experiences and experiments with staying motivated. um, is knowing what you can control and in applying yourself best towards it. The author even gives a nice example in his book. He gives a story about school kids who are complimented on things that they can control. So when school kids were told, "Hey, I really liked how you prepared for this test," or "I really liked how you pronounced these certain words that were difficult," that seemed to have a positive impact on their performance in their tests. On the other hand, when similar school children were complimented on things that were outside of their control, like, "Hey, I quite like that you're so good at math," or "I like that you can remember a certain chemistry formula." So these compliments didn't have a positive impact on these children's scores because they were complimented on something that was outside of their control. So these compliments didn't necessarily motivate these school children. So this is the trick to stay motivated, is knowing what we can control and doing our best on it. Trick to focusing well is knowing the tendencies of the mind. Author shared two tendencies of our mind: cognitive tunneling, reactive thinking. So to be respectful of time, I invite you to actually tune back into how to focus, how to enhance focus, the session that we had on how to enhance focus, where we talk in detail about these two tendencies of the mind. But the one thing that's in our control here, and which is our trick to focusing well, is knowing our own mind's unique tendencies. We're all different. We all have our triggers and things that work us up in a good way and a bad way. So knowing that is the key to focusing well. And another neat strategy that the author shared was to use mental models to imagine in in high resolution detail of how we're going to go about things. So let's say I have this report I want to work at, I need to work on at work, right? So before I actually start working on this report, author suggests I need to use a mental model. I need to imagine myself working on this report. I need to imagine myself facing the obstacles that might be in my way of working on this report, and I need to imagine how I successfully overcome these obstacles. And when I do this over and over again, two things happen. Number one is I, in a way, strengthen myself towards the real obstacles that are gonna approach me when I work on that report, because I've already dealt with those obstacles or similar obstacles in my imagination. So when I actually get that obstacle, hey, I know how to deal with it. And when my mind is not shattered or imbalanced by that obstacle, I'm able to actually apply my mind towards resolving that obstacle. And the other thing, the second thing that happens when I use this imaginary model is I also prepare my mind to accept success. Because guess what? Just like how we are disturbed by obstacles, we're also disturbed by success. Like for me personally, if I feel like I'm nearing the end of any assignment, I feel happy. And I also feel a bit distracted because I keep thinking about how the end's gonna look instead of actually working towards that end. So using mental models and using our imagination in going through this whole process several times, we prepare our minds for the failures as well as the success. And that helps us stay focused throughout. Trick to making effective decisions. We already discussed thinking about the why and the how. But what's important is knowing when to think of the how and knowing when to think of the why. So, like we already discussed, right? It's good to think of the why am I applying for this degree or this job before I get that degree and that job, before I go for that degree and that job, right? And it's useful, more realistic to think about the how am I gonna get this degree or how am I gonna work on this job or on this assignment when the time comes. It doesn't make sense to get anxious about the how when we're not there yet, right? So the author suggests it's important to know what stage of life you're in. Is it a short-term stage? Is it a long-term stage? And most importantly, it's very important to link these stages together, to know what short-term stages need to come together to create a long-term stage. Um, or rather, also knowing what long-term stages are going to be repeatable versus which ones are not going to be repeatable, because that helps you sort of enhance your perspective. You know, this might be a once in a lifetime opportunity, right? So I need to do my best. And if it's not a once in a lifetime opportunity, let me see what I can learn from it so that the next time around I can actually apply myself better. So with that said, that's the end of our first part of this book summary. Next week, next Sunday, we'll summarize being innovative, being mindful, based on our discussion about Diwali, about the holidays, about how that makes us feel and how we can carry that feeling into our daily lives. So thank you for joining us in today's discussion. I'd like to hear from you about any experiences that you'd like to share about the different stages of life that you were in and how that affected your motivation, your focus, and your goal setting. I'm going to stop sharing now. Radha, I can't really hear you. Can you hear Radha?
Okay, how about now?
Yep, I can hear you now. Thank
There
you.
we go. My mic sometimes goes in and out. Just wanted to say thank you for the summary. And what kept running through my mind as I was listening to it is that pretty much everything has a life cycle. Uh, People who know me know that I have a sleep disorder, but it went undiagnosed for 7 years. So I was like talking to Eastern and Western doctors and just completely flummoxed by why is it that I'm not sleeping? What is it that I need to be doing differently? And I just reached this point. I remember very specifically before my doctor finally said, okay, well, let's get a sleep study, just in case. And I remember I was sitting on the bus on my way to get the sleep study. And I had this feeling of, I think this part of my life is over. I felt like I had completed a cycle. And then I did. I got the sleep study. I don't have sleep apnea, but I have something that's very similar where my throat doesn't completely close up, but it gets much narrower. It's like sucking air through a straw. And so then it was over, then this was 2 years ago. My sleep is so much better ever since then. And so I just think about how everything really has a life cycle of whether it's your health or your job or the place you're living or even your phone, it all has a life cycle. So that's it.
Yeah. Wow, thank you for sharing that. That must have been, can't imagine.
It's pretty terrible. I would not recommend having a sleep disorder. Not that anybody can help it, but it's not enjoyable at all.
Point taken, yeah. Wow. So as you were sharing that, Radha, to me it seemed like I realized actually that some stages you might not really know when they're about to end, right? Like in your situation, you weren't really aware of when the stage is gonna end. And like a semester, you didn't or like a trimester in school, you didn't have a curriculum. Wow, so that I'm sure that was difficult. So would you say that the key in such situations when you're not sure of when that stage is gonna end, would you say that the key there to keep surviving is to just keep working and reworking on the how, because slowly but surely you will get to that answer of how to do it the right way?
I think it's mostly keeping in mind that it has a life cycle, because I went through this hope and despair cycle of, okay, I'm going to try this thing and maybe it'll fix it. And then when it didn't, I sunk into despair of it. Now, okay, it's terrible. It's always going to be like this. It's never going to change. And so I think that there's something about maintaining that perspective of everything has a life cycle. It's going to end eventually. You may not know when. Just keeping that in mind somehow is helpful.
Yeah. Good things and bad things, they're all transient, right? Yeah, they're not gonna end. They're gonna end. They're not gonna last forever. Yeah. Help with the perspective. Yeah.